Hey guys, welcome to Through the Bible, verse by verse, a plain and simple study of the entire Bible, book by book, chapter by chapter, and verse by verse. We are in 1 Samuel chapter 7. Now, we're, oh, excuse me. This is going to be where we're going to shift from Samuel leading, the prophet leading the judges leading, and then going into the kings. And what's interesting about this is that it's not as glorious. This is, to me, one of the dark times, and we'll get to that when we get to the point. It's the reason why they asked for a king. Now, remember, up until this time, God had led them. They've had the supernatural presence of God. And again, so for them, the reason why they're going to ask for a king is amazing. And interesting enough, if you remember, in the book of Deuteronomy, God makes provisions for the king. So some 400 years previous, he includes this in the law. That's amazing. All right, so 1 Samuel. All right, let's bring up 1 Samuel chapter 7. Now, remember, Samuel now is leading the country. He is really the last judge. And last time I said that Eli was the last judge. I'm going to say Eli was the last judge / priest. Samuel is the last judge / prophet. Okay, so there was kind of different dual roles there. Samuel is actually the last judge before they will transition to a king and the period of the kings. It says, so the men of Kiriath-Jearim came for the ark of the Lord and took it to Abinadab's house on the hill, and they consecrated his son Eleazar to take care of it. Time went by until 20 years had passed since the ark had been taken to Kiriath-Jearim. Then the house of Israel began to seek the Lord. Now, so this, you could say, revival was under Samuel. You will always note when good leadership, the people prosper under good leadership. Verse 3, Samuel told them, if you are returning to the Lord with all of your heart, get rid of the foreign gods and the asterisks that are among you. Dedicate yourselves to the Lord and worship only him. Then he will rescue you from the hand of the Philistines. So the Israelites removed the Baals and the asterisks and only worship the Lord. Again, amazing that this even has to happen, since they actually had manifestations of the presence of God. Verse 5, Samuel said, gather all the Israelites at Mizpah, and I will pray to the Lord on your behalf. And when they gathered at Mizpah, they drew water and poured it out in the Lord's presence. They fasted that day. And there they confessed, we have sinned against the Lord. And Samuel judged the Israelites at Mizpah. Now again, when he says judge them, this was the role of the judge as leading the people in the law of the Lord. Okay. Verse 7, and when the Philistines heard that the Israelites had gathered at Mizpah, the rulers marched up towards Israel. When the Israelites heard about it, they were afraid because of the Philistines. And the Israelites said to Samuel, don't stop crying out to the Lord our God for us, so that he will save us from the hand of the Philistine. Now, one other interesting thing about this time period here, and this is one you want to be careful about how we use these kind of verses right here. Under the New Testament, there is no mediator. So Samuel was the mediator. The prophets were the mediator. We do not have that. In other words, the people came to the leaders, so the priests or prophets, and as they're saying, pray for us, right? Under the New Testament, Jesus is our mediator, and as Jesus said, you have access to pray to the Father yourself. Verse 9. Then Samuel took a young lamb and offered it as a whole burnt offering to the Lord. He cried out to the Lord on the behalf of Israelites, and the Lord answered him. Samuel was offering the burnt offering as the Philistines drew near to fight against Israel. The Lord thundered loudly against the Philistines that day and drew them into such confusion they fled before Israel. Then the men of Israel charged out of Mizpah and pursued the Philistines, striking them down all the way to the place below Beth-kar. Afterwards Samuel took a stone and set it upright between Mizpah and Shin. He named it Ebenezer, explaining, the Lord has helped us to this point. Now, I just want to make a quick thing right here. Ebenezer. Now, you know the name Ebenezer from Ebenezer Scrooge. I didn't know Ebenezer was a Jewish or Hebrew name. And it means the Lord has helped us to this point. Now, that could explain some of the outcomes of the Ebenezer Scrooge. But I digress. 13. So the Philistines were subdued, and they did not invade Israel's territory again. The Lord's hand was against the Philistines all of Samuel's life. The cities from Ekron to Gath, which they had taken from Israel, were restored. Israel even rescued the surrounding territories from the Philistine control. There was also peace between Israel and the Amorites. Samuel judged Israel throughout his life. Every year he would go on a circuit to Bethel, Gilgal, and Mizpah, and would judge Israel at these locations. Then he would return to Ramah because his home was there, and he judged Israel there, and he built an altar to the Lord there. So again, we see that Samuel's circuit, or circular, in the sense going from town to town, and he would hear the cases, he would see about the people, and arbitrate. That's part of the role of the judge. And remember, he was also a prophet. All right, but we'll get into that later. All right, so when Samuel grew old, he appointed his sons as judges over Israel. His firstborn name was Joel, and his second was Abijah, and they were judges in Bathsheba. However, his sons did not walk in his ways, and they turned towards dishonest gain, took bribes, and perverted judges. Now, this is kind of sad. Samuel was a good king. He was not a king, I'm sorry. He was a good judge, and yet his sons were evil. Verse 4, so all the elders of Israel gathered together and went to Samuel at Ramah. They said to him, look, you are old, and your sons do not follow your example. Therefore appoint a king to judge us, the same as other nations have. Now, this is a sad, to me, testament here. This is a sad testament that, notice why they want a judge. Notice this. Therefore appoint a king to judge us the same as other nations, when they had the Lord himself. Now, they used the occasion of Samuel's wicked sons, okay, but they still had Samuel. And what is interesting is that they could have said, well, why don't you pray to the Lord to give us a leader, not like your wicked sons, but like you. Instead, they asked for a king. And then, again, this is sad. All right, so verse 6, and when they said, give us a king to judge us, Samuel considered their demand sinful, so he prayed to the Lord. The Lord told him, listen to the people and everything they say to you. They have not rejected you. They have rejected me as their king. And so even a sadder commentary here, that they actually were rejecting the Lord. Now, of course, they have been doing this all along. Verse 8, they are doing the same thing to you that they have done to me since the day I brought them out of Egypt until this day, abandoning me and worshiping other gods. So listen to them, but you must solemnly warn them and tell them about the rights of the king who will rule over them. So in other words, right there, this is a be careful what you ask for, because you just might get it. And we're going to see this as we move forward. Verse 10, Samuel told all of the Lord's words to the people who were asking for him a king. He said, these are the rights of the king who will rule over you. Now, he's going to tell them, and what's amazing, that they won't care. But I want you to pay attention what he tells them. He says, these are the rights of the king who will rule over you. He will take your sons and put them to use in his chariots, on his horses, on his running in front of his chariots. He can appoint them for his use as commanders of thousands, commanders of fifties, to plow his grounds, or to reap his harvest, or to make his weapons of war, or the equipment for his chariots. He can take your daughters to become perfumers, cooks, and bakers. He can take your best fields, vineyards, and olive orchards, and give them to his servants. He can take a tenth of your grain of your vineyards and give them to his officials and servants. He can take your male servants, your female servants, your best young men, and your donkeys, and use them for his work. He could take a tenth of your flock, and you yourselves can become his servants. And when that day comes, you will cry out because of the king you have chosen for yourselves. But the Lord won't answer you on that day. Now, we know this to be true in governments today, right? One of the things we cry out all the time is how unfair judges are. For example, eminent domain. Now, in our country, in our nation, it's a lot different, but it does happen. Right now, there is a raging war going on between who's in control and how many are in control. And remember, America is a little different in its governing the governors like that. But throughout history, see, and even the kingdoms that they covered, it was worse. Notice he says, the king will have a right to take your sons and your daughters, put them in his service, take your fields, take whatever you own, and use it for whatever they want. And that's the sad thing, because their response, which I'll get to in a moment, is even worse. Because at this point they think they don't care. But imagine we had it during our time briefly when the draft, when the government said, you know what, if you were 18 years old and older, you had to register for the army. Now that has since, of course, been done away with. But as I said, like things like eminent domain. Now America, of course, has more freedom. Think about nations that don't. We think about Russia right now, right? Look at what Russia is doing. And not everyone has the ideology of freedom. He's telling them, you don't have rights. You won't have the kind of justice because the king will be able to do whatever he wants. Now you need to understand, he says. Alright, so verse 19 says, and the people refused to listen to Samuel. No, they said, we must have a king over us. Then we will be like all the other nations. Our king will judge us, go out before us, and fight our battles. Now this is sad that you wanted a king to be like the other nations, when they had it way better. Okay? Way better. So verse 21, Samuel listened to all of the people's words and then repeated them to the Lord. Listen to them, the Lord told Samuel, appoint for them a king. Samuel told the men of Israel, each of you go back to your city. Samuel wasn't too happy about that. Right? Samuel was kind of like, okay, you guys are disgusting. Notice the Lord says, this is what they have always been. And they have, right? Remember, no other nation have had as its leader God, right? No other nations have had the manifestation of God as the presence of God. That's the most astounding thing to me. I said this in the last study. If you do a timeline from Moses to the Babylonian Empire, exile, it's about 1,000 years. Okay. And then you add another 500 years for what's called the intertestament period, the Dark Ages. Dark period of time, about 1,500 years to Christ. Okay. But in all of that time, Israel has always, during that period of time, from Moses to the Babylonian exile, the biggest sin for them is paganism. They repeatedly fell into paganism. And it won't take until the Babylonian exile that they will finally kind of get over that particular sin of paganism. They're going to reject God in other ways. But in terms of just, as you see here, what they're saying, wanting to be like the other nations. Well, the other nations were paganism. The other nations were they were violent. They were sinful, immoral beyond belief. They would offer their babies in a sacrifice. We read about Dagon, their god. There were other gods that they would make, that the palms, the gods like this, and the palms would glow hot, and they would lay the babies on there. That's what was meant by offering the babies in the fire. The other nations were incredibly immoral. Okay, sexual perversion. In fact, the very worship was sexual perverse. So in other words, pagan worship most of the time involves some type of sexual perversion. And this is who Israel wanted to be like. They looked at those nations and said, hey, I want to be like them. There was incredible violence. And let's not forget, they just came out of the horrible, brutal thumb of the Philistines. And yet they're saying, we want to be like those nations. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. I often say that the unbelief of the Jews is unbelievable. All right, guys. Chapter 9 in the next study. I'll see you then. All right.